Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Anne-Marie, and today I'm going to discuss the 10 things I love about you, Anthony Horowitz's Hawthorne and Horowitz series. This is a no spoilers book review, so don't worry about me revealing any plot twists or ruining any surprise endings. The whole point of this is to give you an inside peek into the books. So here we go. Anthony Horowitz's Hawthorne and Horowitz series currently contains 5 classic whodunits set in present-day England. In the first book, The Word is Murder, a woman walks into a funeral parlor, arranges her own funeral, and 6 hours later, someone murders her. Former detective Daniel Hawthorne is called in as a consultant. He then approaches author Anthony Horowitz about writing the story. Although initially reluctant, Anthony Horowitz eventually agrees, and the two of them form an unusual partnership while working together to solve the case. The Sentence is Death is the second book in the series. In this book, a successful divorce lawyer with many enemies is bludgeoned to death with an expensive bottle of wine. This is odd, especially considering he didn't drink. Before leaving the crime scene, the killer paints a 3-digit number on the wall, which baffles police investigators. They call private investigator Hawthorne, who then brings along author Anthony Horowitz to write the story. The third book, A Line to Kill, takes place at a literary festival on the island of Alderney. The authors in attendance include a well-known chef who wrote a cookbook, a blind medium who tells her story in her autobiography, a historical writer, a children's book author, a French performance poet, and of course Anthony Horowitz and Daniel Hawthorne. The first murder ever to occur on the island of Alderney happens while they are there, and since the island does not have a police department, Hawthorne helps with the investigation. The Twist of a Knife is the fourth book in the series. This one takes us back to London, specifically the Vaudeville Theatre in London's West End, when a critic who gave a scathing review to a play written by Anthony Horowitz ends up dead. He becomes the prime suspect in her death. Of course, only one man can prove his innocence, his newly estranged partner in solving crime, Detective Daniel Hawthorne. Close to Death is the fifth book in this series, and it revolves around a gruesome murder in a gated community in one of the most desirable areas in London. When an obnoxious, inconsiderate, noisy neighbor moves into the once quiet and peaceful community, all the neighbors have reason to want him gone, and all have a motive for his murder. This complicates things, especially when his homicide investigation opens the door to lies, deception, and further death. The first thing I love about this series is that author Anthony Horowitz himself is a character working alongside Daniel Hawthorne. These books are fictional murder mysteries, but they're presented as true crime, especially since Anthony Horowitz includes tidbits about his personal life, including his writing process, and treats Daniel Hawthorne as a real-life private investigator who he tags along with while Hawthorne investigates. The second thing I love about this series is Daniel Hawthorne. A former detective inspector with the Metropolitan Police Service in London, Daniel Hawthorne worked as a murder specialist and had 10 years on the force before getting fired. He now works as a consultant to the police who is called in when a case is proving difficult to solve. Hawthorne is a middle-aged, white, impatient, grumpy ex-detective who smokes, swears, used to be married, has an 11-year-old son, and hates talking about himself, although we eventually learn he's in a book club and he enjoys making models of planes, trains, boats, tanks, and jeeps. He's clever, interesting, intuitive, well-educated, and bloody brilliant, which is why the police turn to him when they are baffled. The third thing I love about this series is from a paragraph found in Chapter 7 of Book 1, The Word is Murder. Author Anthony Horowitz admits the following. If I had sat down to write an original murder mystery story, I wouldn't have chosen anyone like Hawthorne as its main protagonist. I think the world has had quite enough of white, middle-aged, grumpy detectives, and I'd have tried to think up something more unusual. A blind detective, a drunk detective, an OCD detective, a psychic detective. They'd all been done. But how about a detective who was all for of those things. This made me laugh. As a lifelong fan of whodunits, I think a blind, psychic, drunk detective who suffers from OCD sounds complicated. Interesting, but complicated. Number 4 on my list is from a paragraph found in Chapter 3 of Book 2, The Sentence is Death. Anthony Horowitz discusses how a clever private detective needs a much less clever police officer to show a distinction between the characters. Holmes has Lestrade. Poirot has Japp. Morse often tussled with Chief Superintendent Strange. It's a simple fact of life that a clever private detective needs a much less clever police officer, in much the same way as a photograph needs both light and darkness. Otherwise, there's no definition. I love that. I think it's a brilliant and artful way of saying contrast is good. It makes a photograph come to life in the same way it makes book characters come to life. Whether it's a clever private detective contrasted against a much less clever police officer, or whether it's a good character contrasted against a vile evil one, both are necessary to make the story come to life. The 5th thing I love about this series occurs in Book 3, A Line to Kill. In Chapter 6 of this book, Anthony Horowitz and Hawthorne both appear on stage at a literary festival for a question and answer session. At one point during the session, Anthony Horowitz reads an extract from Chapter 4 of the first book of the series. Although it doesn't specify what he read, it mentions Hawthorne looking over the crime scene. Curious about what he would have chosen to read to the audience, I went back to the first book of the series and reread Chapter 4, appropriately titled Scene of the Crime. This is the extract that I would have chosen. Again, this is Anthony Horowitz describing Hawthorne looking over the crime scene. I was fascinated by the way he searched for clues. He didn't speak to me. He barely noticed I was there. He reminded me a little of a sniffer dog at an airport. There is never any reason to suppose that there will be drugs or bombs in any of the suitcases, but the dog will examine every one of them and will be sure to find anything that's there. Hawthorne had the same vagueness, the same certainty. Number 6 on my list is from the 4th book of the series, The Twist of a Knife. As I mentioned earlier, the plot of this book involves a play written by Anthony Horowitz. The name of the play is MINDGAME, and in Chapter 2, prior to telling us the plot, Anthony Horowitz admits that MINDGAME was inspired by SLEUTH by Anthony Shaffer. The play SLEUTH was a huge hit that ran for over 2,000 performances, won major awards, and was filmed twice, once in 1972 and again in 2007. Interestingly, Michael Caine stars in both films. The first time in 1972, playing the young Milo Tyndall opposite Laurence Olivier, who plays the older Andrew Wyke. And the second time in 2007, playing the older Andrew Wyke opposite Jude Law, who plays the young Milo Tyndall. In Chapter 2 of The Twist of a Knife, Anthony Horowitz also mentions Ira Levin's Death Trap, which also stars Michael Caine in the film adaptation, this time playing opposite Christopher Reeve. If you are a fan of mysteries, I highly recommend these movies. Although they have a small cast of characters, they are loaded with twists and turns and will keep you guessing. The 7th thing on my list is from Book 5 of the series, Close to Death. What I loved most about this book is that unlike the other 4 books in the series, the murder mystery isn't an active case. The murder that Anthony Horowitz writes about happened 5 years ago. What's interesting is that even though Hawthorne already solved the case, he refuses to reveal the murderer to Anthony Horowitz. Instead, he provides him with all his case notes and lets him figure it out himself. The book is divided into 9 sections that alternate between present day and what happened 5 years ago. It also alternates between third-person narrative and first-person. I love this format, and I think Anthony Horowitz executes it brilliantly. As a quick side note, in part 6 of this book, titled A Locked Room Mystery, Anthony Horowitz mentions how, in his opinion, the best locked room mysteries come from Japan. He then recommends Murder in the Crooked House by Soji Shimada, in which the setting becomes an accomplice to the crime. He also recommends The HONJIN Murders by Seishi Yokomizo, in which the gurgle of a water wheel and the music played on the koto, a sort of zither, are both integral to the plot. Per his recommendations, I read both of these books, and yes, I agree with him, they are fiendish, elegant, and sheer genius. The eighth thing I love about this series is Kevin. He is a recurring character who lives on the third floor in the same building as Hawthorne. He's a teenager who uses a motorized wheelchair to get around because he was born with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it is slowly stealing away his muscles and his ability to move. Despite his disease, Kevin is a witty and brilliant computer hacker who can access all sorts of information, from the police national computer to the 5 million CCTV cameras across the UK. In Chapter 7 of Book 4, The Twist of a Knife, Anthony Horowitz writes the following. It would have been quite wrong to think of Kevin as disabled. He was one of the most spectacularly enabled people I had ever met. As it turns out, Kevin is especially helpful to Anthony Horowitz in this book. The ninth thing I love about this series is Hawthorne's book club. In Chapter 10 of Book 2, The Sentence is Death, we learn that Hawthorne's book club is currently reading A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Because Anthony Horowitz has written about Sherlock Holmes, The House of Silk, and Moriarty, they want him to attend their next session. He does so, and in Chapter 16 we meet the people in the book club. This is one of my favorite chapters of the series. The meeting is hosted by Kevin's mother, Lisa, and Anthony Horowitz describes the people in the book club in the following way. An assortment of people stood clutching drinks, looking awkward in the way guests always do when they choose to stand together, even though they're surrounded by places to sit. My first impression, possibly unfair, was that they seemed to be quite freakish, mainly because they were also very different. A very tall woman with a very short man, a pair of identical twins, a plump lady in a sari, a silver-haired, distinguished-looking man, perhaps South American, an extravagantly bearded man in a kilt, another small and shrimpy man with round glasses in tweed. There were about a dozen of them in all. If I hadn't known they were connected by books, it would have been difficult to find a reason for them being in the same room. The rest of the chapter is humorous, heartwarming, and gives us greater insight into Hawthorne's character. And finally, the 10th thing I love about this series is that all the little details add up to something big. In my opinion, Anthony Horowitz is the reigning king of misdirection. He does it very well. He does it so well, in fact, you don't even suspect he's doing it until you get to the end of the book and read the solution and wonder how you didn't figure it out before you revealed it. All the clues are there. He plays fair by dropping them like little breadcrumbs throughout the story. But he diverts your attention to something else. He's a literary magician who has perfected the art of distraction. While you are closely watching the big plot on the front burner, another one is simmering on the back burner. And that's the one that's going to boil over and burn you because you're not paying attention to it. If you've read any of the books in this series and you would like to add to my list of things to love, feel free to do so in the comments. Until next time, take care, be well, and happy reading.